This is Faith Ignited, the podcast where we put God back into history.
Episode 13, Children of the Present. The halls were quiet and morose as Abraham Lincoln's long legs carried him toward his office for his regular Tuesday cabinet meeting. It wasn't the halls themselves, he admitted inwardly, as much as his own state of mind that likely rendered them depressing. His clothes hung loosely over his body, swaying with his movements. He'd lost weight since taking the presidency, and his gangly limbs took slow, heavy steps toward the office door. He pulled in one last fortifying breath before entering. The furniture in the room was old, passed down from previous presidents. Under different circumstances, he might have had the room renovated, but he wasn't about to spend government funds for something so frivolous during a war. As was the case, his cabinet members were seated around the long wooden table in the middle of the room, a furnishing that had probably been acquired during the presidency of John Quincy Adams or Andrew Jackson. Several maps and bundles of paper were spread across the table's surface, likely containing information about appointments, officer ranks, or troop movements. The place was buzzing with conversation. Wearily, Lincoln moved to his chair as the words swirled all around him. He knew the subject of their discussion: the string of terrible defeats the Union had recently suffered. Now, with the Second Battle of Bull Run lost, things appeared all the more unpromising. Their early predictions of Northern victory were proving false. The recent newspapers were full of criticism of General Pope, General McClellan for not coming to Pope's aid, and of Lincoln himself for allowing the entire debacle to occur. As though it wasn't challenging enough to be making such heavy decisions that might prove their success or failure, Lincoln now had to fight off the immense criticism from every side, regarding his leadership as well as his position on abolition. Some said he wasn't severe enough against slavery, while others said that he was mad to even consider abolishing it in the middle of a war. It did seem terribly pointless to try and cry emancipation, when so far he'd been unsuccessful in trying to enforce even the Constitution on the rebellious states. The draft for the Emancipation Proclamation that he'd penned seemed to burn a hole in his pocket. But he couldn't quite shake the fear that releasing it might very well prove their destruction and alienate the only allies that they had. Lincoln had only ever sought to preserve the Union, but which route would lead to that ultimate end he wasn't sure. God's will still seemed terribly unclear. As the meeting unfolded, never had there been such a prevailing feeling of despondency. You could see it on the faces of everyone present. Lincoln understood feeling utterly disheartened himself. He was like an empty well from which water kept being sought, and knew the announcement he was about to make would not be a welcome one. Still, he pushed forward. "I have decided," he began, "to reappoint George B. McClellan. He will once again be commanding general." The room exploded in a flurry of disapproval. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton became indignant, rising from his chair and beginning to list his objections. Salmon P. Chase, Secretary of the Treasury, proclaimed, "McClellan's experience as a military commander has been little else than a series of failures." He pointed out McClellan's decision not to come to General Pope's aid, concluding, "This rendered him unworthy of our trust." Lincoln listened, but his position was not swayed. He'd already told McClellan of his decision. Now all they needed was a miracle. I want you to imagine for a moment that you're a Hebrew standing on the shore of the Red Sea. You've witnessed many miracles already, but now, backed against what appears to be no escape, you see destruction staring you in the face. But even as you brace yourself for the worst, Moses cries out, "Fear not, stand still." And these profound words, "The Lord shall fight for you." When you look at the American seal and see the eagle, you probably don't realize how close you came to seeing an image of the Hebrews being led out of Egypt instead. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson were appointed to design the U.S. seal. And before they talked about the eagle, Franklin proposed a depiction of Moses parting the Red Sea. and the Lord leading the children of Israel through on dry ground. Obviously, the eagle won out in the end, and its ties to the Iroquois nation are really interesting and have some powerful messages, but there's part of me that wishes they'd ended up going with the Hebrews' deliverance. I think it would have served as a constant reminder of how our nation has had to just as fully rely on God for our deliverance. Deliverance might very well be the most appropriate word to summarize America's history altogether. It's a story of God's hand stretching out to save us. When the southern states broke away from the Union, they formed their own constitution. So we had these two polarized forces, seeking to conquer the other and determine the future of America. The North supporting the Constitution the founders penned, and the South with their new constitution focused on states' rights and, of course, the institution of slavery. Yet it's strange because the Southern Constitution boldly invoked, in the first paragraph, quote, "the favor and guidance of Almighty God." Isn't that interesting? Both sides claimed to have the favor of God. So that might lead us to wonder, how can we know which cause God truly supported? Other than, of course, the outcome. The answer is simple: miracles. The stretching forth of God's hand will show you His support. But as I pointed out in a previous episode, while slavery was what initially divided the states, President Lincoln didn't raise the banner of emancipation until well into the war. In fact, Lincoln wrote, "My paramount objective is to save the Union, not to save or to destroy slavery." But I hasten to add that in the same letter, he declared this: "I have stated my purpose according to my view of my official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere should be made free." But Lincoln was in a difficult position. At the time he was drafting his Emancipation Proclamation, the North had several devastating losses, the culminating of which was the Second Battle of Bull Run. After he received the news, Lincoln came into his secretary's room and said, "Well, John, we're whipped again." Newspapers printed articles full of heavy criticism of both the Lincoln Presidency and the commanding generals. Then, unexpectedly, Lincoln reappointed George B. McClellan to his former position as commanding general of the United States armies. Now, George B. McClellan is likely a name that you're not familiar with. He is a bit of an obscure character in history, but he pops up at these critical moments that should make us take a closer look at him. He was first appointed commanding general in July of 1861, where his responsibility was to defend the capital and attack the forces in northern and East Virginia. But his passive approach to warfare upset many of the nation's leaders, including Lincoln. But his hesitancy to send his men to be sacrificed, as he put it, endeared him to his soldiers and won him their loyalties. There's something else I want to tell you about McClellan, something that might lend us some greater insight later on. The Bible says that where there is no vision, the people perish. So it seems appropriate that God would give a leader vision for the purpose of preservation. Something incredible happened to McClellan several days after his initial appointment in 1861. Now, I've never prefaced a narrative before, but I'm going to preface this one. What I'm about to share with you is one of the most incredible stories I've ever come across. It comes from the Library of Congress, but most modern thinkers, especially those of a more secular leaning, will tell you that they consider it a work of fiction, something the recorder Wesley Bradshaw, the pen name for Charles Wesley Alexander, created. But the reality is, this would be a very difficult account to prove or disprove, because there was only one witness, which, by the way, never denied the experience, even though he would have had plenty of opportunity to do so. So I'll leave it up to your own personal judgment, whether or not you believe it. Either way, it's a fascinating piece of history. I will simply present it to you and let you draw your own conclusions. I've kept the dialogue and nearly all of the descriptions exact to the original document. I did simplify some of the older language so that you don't get bogged down by the unfamiliar vocabulary, as well as changing it from first person to third person. But the message is the same, and I, for one, believe it to be true. Now you decide. General George B. McClellan stared down at the maps and reports on scouts scattered about his desk. He had been in Washington less than 3 days since taking his new position, and at 2 a.m. he was thoroughly exhausted. He pushed the maps and reports away, lowering his head to rest on his folded arms. Even the occasional booming of guns being placed in position on the entrenchments was not enough to prevent his sleep. He couldn't have slept more than 10 minutes when the door of his room, which he knew he carefully locked, was suddenly thrown open and someone strode up to him, laying a hand on his shoulder. He heard a slow, solemn voice say, "General McClellan, do you sleep at your post? Rouse you, or ere it can be prevented, the foe will be in Washington." Never before in his life had he heard a voice possessing the commanding and even terrible tones of the one that addressed him these words, and the sensation that passed through him as it fell upon his ears. And cowering, he shrank into himself at his own negligence. It was like the whistling, shrieking sweep of a storm or grape shot, discharged directly through his brain. He could not move, however hard he tried to raise his head from the table. He wanted to answer the unknown intruder, yet was helpless to do so. He had no choice but to listen as the low, solemn voice repeated, "General McClellan, do you sleep at your post?" There was something peculiar about it this time. It seemed as though George were an atom suspended in the center of an infinite space, and that the voice came from a hollow distance all around him. As the last word was uttered, he regained by some felt and yet unknown power his volition. He started up, or at least thought he did so. He couldn't really tell if he was awake or asleep. His first thought was about his maps, and before his eyelids had half opened, his hand was grasping them. But that was not all. The table was still in front of him, and the maps all crumpled in his tightened clutch were still there, but everything else had disappeared. The furniture, the walls of the apartment and ceiling were gone. His gaze turned southward, and there, spread out before his eyes, was a living map. No other words seemed to describe it. In one grand sweep, his eyes took in the whole expanse of country as far south as the Gulf of Mexico, and from the Atlantic Ocean on the east to the Mississippi River toward the west. But before he fixed his complete attention upon the immense scene, he thought of the mysterious visitant whose voice he just heard, and turned toward its source. An apparition stood at his left, just 6 feet away. He searched his features, hoping to recognize him, but he was disappointed, for the statue-like figure was nothing but a vapor, a cloud having only the general outlines of a man. Feeling troubled and confused, John heard the shadowy figure say in the same low, solemn tone as before, "General McClellan, your time is short. Look to the southward." George felt unable to resist the command, even if he'd wanted to, so again he looked to the south, his eyes taking in the living map. Out on the Atlantic, he saw the various vessels bathed by moonlight. He saw Charleston Harbor and its force with its pacing sentinels and sullen-looking barbette guns. His eyes followed the ocean line all the way around into the Gulf, to New Orleans and then to Mississippi. Fort Pickens, and in fact every fortification along this water boundary did he see with great clarity. The sight filled George with great surprise. His eyes took in everything with lightning-like detail. Every mountain range, every hill, every valley, every forest, every meadow, every river, every city, every camp, every tent, every body of man, every sentinel, every earthwork, every cannon, and in short, every living and every dead thing, no matter how large or small. George's blood seemed to stop in its channels. He was overjoyed. This knowledge, he thought, might give them the advantage needed to ensure a speedy and happy ending to the war. This thought consumed his mind as he heard that slow, solemn voice say, "General McClellan, take your map and note what you behold. Tarry not, your time is short." He started, and then glancing at the unearthly speaker, saw him extend his arm and point to the south. Smoothing out the largest and most accurate of his maps, he grabbed a pencil and once more gazed out over the living map. As he looked this time, a thrilling chill raced through him. Pencil in hand, he compared the map before him to the living map, and saw the masses of the enemy's forces being hurried to certain points to thwart movements he planned to make in a day or two. and in Washington, 2 heavy columns poised for a concentrated attack that he instantly knew would succeed if something wasn't done quickly to prevent it. "Treachery, treachery!" George cried out. His blood seemed to turn to ice with fear. Ruin and defeat seemed to stare him in the face. "General McClellan," he heard the voice say in his ear, "you have been betrayed. And had not God willed otherwise, ere the sun of tomorrow had set, the Confederate flag would have waved above the Capitol and your own grave. But note what you see. Your time is short. Tarry not." George immediately began writing, transferring to his map all that he'd witnessed on the living map. He felt some mysterious and unearthly influence over him, helping him to capture the minutest detail without the slightest effort, delay, or mistake. Finally he finished, and the pencil dropped from his fingers. Even as he'd been writing, he'd become aware of a light to his left that steadily grew brighter. And then as he finished his task, it became instantly more intense than the noonday sun. He quickly raised his eyes, and were he to live forever, he never would forget what he then saw. He no longer beheld a dim, shadowy figure, but the glorified, refulgent spirit of Washington, the father of this country, and now the second time, its savior. Words could never describe the might of the returned spirit, only that Washington, as he beheld him, was the most godlike being he could ever have conceived of. Like a weak, dazzled bird, George stood staring at the vision. From the sweet, silent repose of Mount Vernon, Washington had risen to once more encircle and raise up with his saving arm their falling, bleeding country. As George continued looking, an expression of sublime kindness came over Washington's face as he said finally, "General McClellan, while yet in the flesh I beheld the birth of the American Republic. It was indeed a hard and bloody one, but God's blessing was upon the nation, and therefore through this her first great struggle for existence, he sustained her, and with his mighty hand brought her out triumphantly. A century has not passed since then, and yet the child republic has taken her position of peer with nations whose page of history extends for ages into the past. She has, since those dark days, by the favor of God, greatly prospered, and now, by very reason of this prosperity, has been brought to her second great struggle. Passing as she is from childhood to opening maturity, she is called on to accomplish that vast result, self-conquest, to learn that important lesson, self-control, self-rule, that in the future will place her in the van of power and civilization. It is here that all nations have hitherto failed, and she too, the Republic of the earth, had not God willed otherwise, would by tomorrow's sunset have been a broken heap of stones, cast up over the grave of human liberty. But her cries have come up out of her borders like sweet incense unto heaven, and she will be saved. Thus shall peace once more come upon her, and prosperity fill her with joy. But her mission will not then be yet finished. For ere another century shall have gone by, the oppressors of the whole earth, hating and envying her exaltation, shall join themselves together and raise up their hands against her. But if she still be found worthy of her high calling, they shall surely be discomfited, and then will be ended her third and last great struggle for existence. Thenceforth shall the Republic go on, increasing in goodness and power, until her borders shall end only in the remotest corners of the earth, and the whole earth shall beneath her shadowing wing become a universal republic. Let her in her prosperity, however, remember the Lord her God, her trust be always in him, and she shall never be confounded." As the heavenly visitor ceased speaking, he drew near to George and raised and spread out his hands above him. While the messenger did not speak, George felt a strange influence coming over him. George reclined his head forward to receive the blessing, the baptism of Washington. The next instant, George heard a peal of thunder and he awoke. He found himself again sitting in his apartment, with everything exactly as it was before he'd fallen asleep, with one exception. The map on which he dreamed he'd been marking was literally covered with a network of pencil marks, signs, and figures. George rose to his feet, rubbing his eyes as he took a turn about the room to convince himself that he was really awake. He again seated himself, but the pencil markings were still there, plain as ever. Before him sat a map so complete with information, it looked as though he'd spent years in gathering and recording its details. Feeling overwhelmed by the ideas crowding his thoughts, George involuntarily sank down upon his knees to seek wisdom and guidance from on high. He got up, feeling refreshed in spirit, and seeming to still hear the heavenly voice echo in his mind, "Your time is short, tarry not." In an instant, his thoughts were clear and active. He immediately distributed to different couriers certain orders executed at specific points, guiding himself by the maps he'd been shown. He leapt into the saddle long before daylight, galloping like a tempest from post to post and from camp to camp, confident that they were in the hands of God and that he would lead the Union to victory. McClellan concluded his vision with these words: "Our beloved, glorious Washington shall again rest quietly, sweetly in his tomb, until perhaps the end of the prophetic century approaches that is to bring the Republic to a third and final struggle, when he may once more, laying aside the cerements of Mount Vernon, become a messenger of succor and peace from the great ruler who has all nations of the earth in his keeping. But the future is too vast for our comprehension. We are the children of the present. When peace shall have folded her bright wings and settled our land, the strange unearthly map marked while the spirit eyes of Washington looked down shall be preserved among the American archives as a precious reminder to the American nation what, in their second struggle for existence, they owe to God and the glorified spirit of Washington. Verily, the works of God are above the understanding of man." Some may balk at this account, but is it really so strange to think that Washington, after sacrificing everything to lay the foundation of this nation, would be concerned about its destiny? It isn't. In fact, it makes perfect sense. God said in the book of Joel that in the last days he would pour out his spirit upon all flesh, and that our sons and daughters would prophesy, and our young men would see visions, and our old men would dream dreams. So really, this shouldn't surprise us. This account just has so much insight that's relevant for our time. And if your mind isn't blown yet, just hold on. As I was researching McClellan's account, I came across something else in the Rare Books and Special Collections Division of the Library of Congress. Something that, up until a couple of weeks ago, I did not know existed. It's an article titled "Startling from Washington, President Lincoln's Vision." It seems McClellan wasn't the only one to receive a visit from George Washington. This article was sent out by an act of Congress in 1863. I'm not going to cover it in its entirety in this episode, but I will include the link to it in the description with my other sources, and I would highly recommend that you go check it out. Lincoln provides a powerful second witness to McClellan's experience. You see, Washington appeared to Lincoln and showed him a lot of the same things that he showed McClellan, and then told Lincoln to restore McClellan to his position because he'd been, quote, "peculiarly assisted from the other world in a dream, and his arm is all-powerful to save the life of the Republic in the fearful peril that is about to come upon her." Lincoln's description of George Washington also fits with McClellan's. He described seeing our first president this way: "I gazed in awe. Before me there seemed to gradually develop itself the figure of a heavenly being, gigantic in stature and with the mien of an angel. This being fastened my attention, and as I looked upon him his features became plainer and plainer, until finally I recognized him as Washington, the great founder of our republic. I could not avert my eyes from that glorious countenance even had I wished." But Washington gave Lincoln some specific counsel. He said, "Servant of the Republic, this is thy work, but good is still within thy grasp. And if thou walk aright and leave the crooked paths into which thou hast suffered thyself to go, all will yet be well, and the unity of the Republic preserved." As he finished relating this interaction, Lincoln concluded, "I have certainly hitherto allowed my judgment to be led by others. Until now, it's almost impossible for me to have my own way in anything. And it's only when public opinion unmistakably expresses itself that I am able to do anything fully consonant with my own feelings. I am not superstitious, but the occurrence that I have just narrated has left such a strong impression upon my mind that it amounts almost to a conviction that the enemy is maturing plans by which, in spite of our own strength, we shall be forced again to defend our own capital. Does this vision have anything to do with Lincoln's decision to reappoint McClellan? Only Lincoln could say. But he told McClellan when he extended the call that the troubles now impending could be overcome better by him than anyone else. Afterwards, McClellan confessed to his wife that he'd been given, quote, "a terrible and thankless task, yet I will do my best with God's blessing to perform it." Once again, McClellan comes back onto the scene at this crucial period. Lincoln extended the reappointment to September 2nd of 1862, and September 7th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee invaded Maryland. It was a bold move, one that sent the Union leaders into a panic. The Confederates were now on Northern soil, and McClellan, once again charged to defend the capital, went with his troops to stop their progress. This is a pivotal moment. The North desperately needed a victory, and once again, God stepped in with a miracle. Corporal Barton W. Mitchell gazed around at the open field stretching out in front of him. He saw areas of the earth flattened by the Confederate tents that had occupied the space just days before. Now it was empty, looking much more like the farmer's field it would have been left unto itself. In September, the planted clovers looked very near the point of harvest. Barton took in several deep breaths, his legs somewhat stiff from their recent march. Their brigade had settled near Frederick City before continuing their march in pursuit of General Lee's army. He could hear Sergeant John Bloss walking several paces behind him. This seemed as good a place as any to rest their tired legs. As he sunk to the earth, Barton looked around at the Maryland landscape, wiping some perspiration from his brow. When they finally got back to their feet, Barton's gaze caught on something. He squinted, not exactly sure what it was. It appeared to be a sort of paper wrapped around something, just lying in the grass. He moved toward it, bending down to pick it up. "What's this?" he murmured, turning it around in his hand to inspect it. It looked like an envelope, and tipping it up, he saw it was wrapped around 3 cigars. Curious, he thought to himself. "What did you find?" he heard John ask as he came to peer over his shoulder. "I don't know," Barton answered. His fingers pulled the envelope free. Inside were 2 sheets of paper. He unfolded them, his gaze scanning over the words. His eyes widened and he heard John's murmur of surprise. It was addressed to Confederate Major General Hill. He was all the more surprised as he read, Special Order 191. "Is this," he began, his gaze dropping to the words at the bottom, "by the command of Robert E. Lee, and was signed R.H. Chilton." Barton stood there dumbfounded for a moment. Could he truly be holding a copy of the enemy's plans? "Do you think this might be legitimate?" he asked John. "I don't know," John answered. "But if it is, this single document might just be the thing that sways the war." On September 13th, 1862, Corporal Barton W. Mitchell went to rest in a field near Frederick, Maryland, where he and Sergeant John Bloss spotted an envelope on the ground, rolled around 3 cigars. This paper would be what history would later call Lee's Lost Order. Robert E. Lee had made a plan for his invasion of the North, where he would divide his army and then regroup later. This was absolutely top secret. Only 8 copies were made and sent by courier to the Confederate generals that were involved. But 1 copy never made it to its destination. The copy found by Corporal Mitchell and Sergeant Bloss was intended for General Hill, but for some reason he never got it. And Lee's Adjutant General, Robert H. Chilton, who had made the copies himself, would insist until his death that he sent it. How it could possibly have been lost within the few minutes' ride from Lee's camp to Hill's camp is a mystery that to this day makes historians scratch their heads, especially because protocol would have demanded that the empty envelope be signed and stamped and then returned to confirm that it had been received. The only reason they didn't notice the loss is because General Jackson, who was the leading officer over Hill, thought it was his responsibility to give Hill the plans. So he made a copy, not realizing that Chilton had already sent one. Hill would always insist that he only ever received the one copy from Jackson. Somehow, a top-secret document was left in the field waiting for 2 Union soldiers to come across it. Keep in mind that the paper was useless unless they could verify it, but the order was passed up the Corps command with miraculous speed. Why? Because Union Staff Colonel Samuel Pittman just happened to know Robert Chilton before the war, and he was able to immediately confirm the signature. Coincidence? I think not. The papers were found in the early morning, and by late morning, the order was verified and in General McClellan's hands. McClellan said, "Here is a paper by which if I am unable to whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." Something else to note is that Lee's lost order was found September 13th, and the first fighting of the Maryland campaign happened the morning of the 14th. Talk about cutting it close. But McClellan did use these papers to make their plans, which gave them a heaven-sent advantage over Lee. And Lincoln was more than a little relieved to receive McClellan's report that the Battle of Antietam, which was the bloodiest day in American history, by the way, was a win for the North. The foe had been driven out of Maryland. But this victory meant so much more than most people realize. 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln held a special cabinet meeting and presented the 4-page document we now know as the Emancipation Proclamation. 2 witnesses at that meeting wrote in their diaries that Lincoln told them when the rebel army was at Frederick, he had determined that if they be driven out of Maryland, he would issue a proclamation of emancipation. Lincoln continued, quote, "I said nothing to anyone, but I made the promise to myself and," Lincoln hesitated before adding, "to my Maker. The rebel army is now driven out, and I am going to fulfill that promise." Lincoln had asked for a sign, and God delivered. He now knew exactly what the Lord's will was. Do we realize how incredible this is? Do we see just how involved God is in the details of things? And without him, our nation would have been founded on slavery instead of freedom for all. This may be a hard concept for some. It may appear that God just chooses favorites, but that is not at all the case. God has and always will be a proponent of liberty. It would be against his very nature to do otherwise. He chose to give us our free will, and the battle to maintain that gift has raged since this world began. 1863 marks the turning of the tide, where the North began to be victorious. I truly believe that's because they finally aligned themselves with God. God wanted the slaves to be free, and when they finally did that, he fought for them. Sometimes when I study the story of the Hebrews, I'm often amazed at just how quick they were to forget the God that guided and preserved them, especially in light of how many miracles that they witnessed. And yet here we are, not many generations after our nation's deliverance, and these miracles have almost completely slipped from the minds of the public. Why? Because more and more, as a whole, our society is rejecting God, becoming far more preoccupied with golden calves than God's laws. And that's a frightening place to be. But as Moses said, we have no need to fear when we stand by the God of Israel. We, even individually, can have much influence for good and turn that awful tide. As General McClellan observed, we are children of the present. Think of that. We are the current players on this world stage, and it's the chess pieces on the board that determine the game. But our time is also short, and we should tarry not in defending the cause of Christ and the cause of liberty. Never underestimate what God can do through simple, everyday people. Those are the kind of people that laid the foundation of America. God-fearing men and women who put their trust in him. And when we seek to preserve faith and freedom, we too will be the beneficiaries of miracles from heaven. The Red Seas will part, manna will be provided, and the faithful delivered. So let us determine now and always to stand by the God of Israel, who is our shadow by day and our pillar of fire by night, whose strong hand preserves nations, and who individually and collectively ignites our faith. If you felt impacted by this episode, Please like, share, and subscribe so that the fire of faith can continue to spread.